This video, we'll quickly review that approach to poetry we discussed, and then talk about Pablo Neruda's poem poetry and answer some of the questions related to it. So, the first step of approaching this poem is just to look it over first, to see what we notice, to look at the title. Right off the bat, looking at the title, it's called poetry. It's appropriate for this unit. It's a nice place to start. Um, but I think it also sets up our subject matter too, that this is going to somehow connect to poetry. Looking it over a little bit more, I noticed that there's 4 stanzas. There's line breaks that seem to be fairly standard. There doesn't seem to be any kind of like pattern or rhyme scheme, or it's not like long, short, anything like that. But there's definitely 4 different stanzas. We'll maybe come back to that later. One thing I just noticed scanning through this, I noticed a lot of sentences start with and. The first word of the first stanza, the first word of the last stanza, a whole bunch of lines throughout. There's a couple other coordinating conjunctions like but or. But just on my first look over, I noticed there's a lot of ands at the beginning of sentences here. I'm not sure if that means anything, if it matters, if it's going to come up later, but it stood out. From there, I'm going to read the poem aloud. This is my first time to read it over, read it slowly, see any patterns, see any effects. Again, just looking for what we notice. So this is Poetry by Pablo Neruda. And at that age, poetry arrived in search of me. I don't know. I don't know where it came from winter or a river. I don't know how or when. No, they were not voices. They were not words or silence. But from a street I was summoned, from the branches of night, abruptly from the others, among violent fires or returning alone. There I was without a face, and it touched me. I did not know what to say. My mouth had no way with names, my eyes were blind, and something started in my soul. Fever or forgotten wings. And I made my own way, deciphering that fire. And I wrote the first faint line, faint, without substance, pure nonsense, pure wisdom of someone who knows nothing. And suddenly, I saw the heavens unfastened and opened, planets palpitating plantations, shadows perforated, riddled with arrows, fire and flowers, the winding night, the universe. And I, infinitesimal being, drunk with the great starry void, likeness, image of mystery, felt myself a pure part of the abyss. I wheeled with the stars, my heart broke loose on the wind. So that's my first time reading it through. Honestly, my first time reading it aloud. I stumbled over a couple times. But I found there was like just some kind of changes in there, and it really picked up around the third stanza that like, and suddenly I saw the heavens. I felt like the tone kind of change, and it get a little bit more I don't know, exciting, passionate. Well, there's definitely some sort of shift there. Now I could read it again slowly. I could go back to a couple parts. Hopefully you read it over to yourself and tried working through it a little bit. And at that point, you might start noticing some of the line breaks. So this is a little bit more of how it's organized. I read it without the line breaks there. I just kind of read up to the punctuation, paused at commas, stops at periods. But as I was going through this and kind of thinking about the line breaks, one thing did stand out to me. Right around here, he does this thing where he says, and I wrote the first faint line, faint, without substance, pure. And if you just stop at that line break, it says this first line he wrote was pure. If we continued on, it adds the word nonsense. It says the first thing he wrote was pure nonsense. So there's kind of he's playing with, was the first, like the first line of poetry he wrote down, was there something pure about being the first thing that came to him? Or was it pure nonsense, meaning it was, his first attempt at it, it didn't really work, it didn't really make much sense. But he's kind of, again, back to that word ambiguity, he's playing with some ambiguity there. Was his first line pure? Was it pure nonsense? And we see how he's kind of using the line break there to suggest both at the same time. And this is our chance to kind of what I was already doing there is to start talking back to it. Maybe you're making some assumptions. Maybe you noticed some things, whether it's something about the title now, about like this speaker. Like I was just saying, it seems like this person wrote their first line of poetry. What I was doing there, I'm already starting to have that conversation back to it. Maybe in some point in there mentioned the tone. The tone got a little bit more exciting. But this is the step where, as I was going through it, I'm starting to talk back to it. I'm starting to have ideas and make some inferences and notice some things about it. And at that point, that's when you're maybe ready to approach some of these questions. I don't always want to dive right into the questions. It's this process of working through it, thinking about it, sitting with it for a little bit, and then getting into them. So, to review these questions, the first question asks about this line: the poetry arrived in search of me. This is one of the first lines of the poem. Um, and the answer of this question is it's about the poet becoming aware of their desire to explore poetry. I think that's the whole meaning of this poem from start to finish. Some of the other answers are a little bit, I think, as a first question, they're a little bit maybe off topic, like the idea of going to an airport to welcome someone or encountering an individual named poetry or receiving a package of poetry. I think that's a little bit too maybe personified. Like, it is a capital P poetry, like big idea poetry. But I don't think it's necessarily capital P because it's a person's name or something like that. And the fact it is also capitalized, maybe think it wasn't that this is someone learning about poetry and trying to write their first few lines and what the experience was, and wanting to explore writing poetry on their own. The second question asks about this line. It says, I don't know where it came from winter or a river. And I think the correct answer to this one is that being inspired, like, they're not, the speaker of this poem isn't sure where this desire came from. They say it was like whether it was just like out of nature, out of winter, from the river, or just from night, or from like just out of nowhere, like they say. I don't know where this desire came from. So the inspiration to write poetry kind of came to them, and they're not sure why they were so attached to it. But inspiration, being inspired to write, and being inspired by poetry, just kind of came to them at some point. They got hooked. The third question asks about this line: there I was without a face. And I think key word in this one is face. That when, they maybe, whether they read their first poem or they picked up the pencil for the first time, they feel like they didn't have a face. They're sitting there without a face, and poetry touched them. I think often, like, the idea of like having a face, or not just having a face, but faces can sometimes symbolize like who we are, being faceless, or having a face. I think it's having the idea of like having an identity. If you're faceless, you're kind of like, indistinct. No one knows who you are. This person, like, it felt like, maybe I didn't know who I was. I didn't really have an identity. I was faceless. I was anonymous in some way until I found poetry, and that kind of gave me a sense of identity. Question 4 asks about this side of something started in my soul. And this is a key moment, I think. So, they've read that first poem, they've had their first experience, maybe picked up that pen, and something started in their soul, like deep within their core, something began. And back to that previous question, as far as it coming from an unknown place, this thing came to them. Again, I think that thing that came to them, that thing that has started, is this fire, like they say in the next line, that this fire comes to them and it starts burning within them. That fire represents their inspiration. They're not necessarily saddened by reading poetry. They're not afraid of it necessarily. And maybe it does create some sense of hope, but they're definitely inspired. And I think this fire represents that inspiration. From there, they talk about how, this fire started in my soul. It's like a fever or forgotten wings, like it made them heat up. I think wings in this sentence talks to maybe idea of like, to have wings. Even if you think about like the advertisement, Red Bull gives you wing. It lifts you up, it picks you up, it pushes you forward. So I think the best answer for this one is passion and possibilities. If you have that fever for poetry, you're heating up, that would connect to passion. Forgotten wings is that maybe that drive or that push, the thing like that lifts you up. The possibilities of where poetry could take them. Question 6 is a vocab question. It's about deciphering, and a really good trick with these vocab questions says, so in the context of the poem, so in this poem, not what deciphering means in other places, but in this poem, what does the word deciphering mean? A trick here is you can always move that word, the options down there. So did they make their way on their own, fearing that fire? Were they fearing that passion? Were they interpreting and trying to figure this out? Were they dreading it and afraid of it again? Or were they consuming the fire? And again, this fire being the passion for poetry. So as we put those words in there, I notice A and C are pretty similar, to fear and to dread. And like I don't think this person is afraid of, like, they're being pushed forward. It's giving them these wings in this moment, and I think they're having to work through it. So I'm going to take off my A and C. I don't think it's fearing. I don't think it's dreading. And I don't think they're consuming the fire. I don't think they're consuming the passion. Maybe they are consumed by it, but that's not how it's phrased in this sentence. It's deciphering the fire. So I think the best option here is interpreting. They make their way on their own. It's up to them to figure out what is poetry, how does it work, what type of poetry do they want to write. So they have to figure it out or interpret this new passion on their own. Question 7, another vocab question. We'll try it again. It's the word infinitesimal. Again, we'll have to work it into the context of the poem here. We'll look at it in the poem. But one thing I do notice about this one is it has a root inside the word. It has the word finite. It has the word finite right inside the word. If something's finite, it's limited, there's not a ton of it, that might help me a little bit. But let's put some of these words in here. So towards the end of the poem, they start, like this poem and poetry is taking them somewhere. They start seeing like the entire universe laid out in front of them. When they see this universe, they feel like they are an infinitesimal being, drunk with the great starry void. Like something has opened up to them. It's almost like made them drunk, like looking out on all of the possibilities and this new maybe appreciation they have for the world. And they feel like an infinitesimal being. In this case, infinitesimal, especially relating to that word, that root of finite there. To be infinitesimal is something that is like unimaginably small, incredibly, incredibly small. Again, with like the entire looking out at this new universe laid out in front of them, they feel small in comparison to it. Number 8 comes back to a line. It says, "So they felt myself a part of the abyss." So again, they are this small, they feel like this, they've again read this poem or wrote their first poem. They feel the universe laid out in front of them. There's some little small being looking out into this starry void, and they feel themselves a part of the abyss. Again, back to the previous stanza, this idea of the universe, that this abyss they see laid out is kind of all of the possibilities, all the worlds, everything laid out in front of them. So not just like planets, not just the individual stars, but everything has kind of come alive to them, the universe. The last question is kind of an overall understanding of this poem. Like, what is the purpose behind this poem? Kind of the larger thematic meanings. It says the purpose of this poem is to illustrate what? The speaker's what? Is it about their new found joy of astronomy? And I do think like the third stanza about the heavens becoming unfastened, planets, shadows, stars, the entire universe, that does have some astronomy in there, but I don't think they've just necessarily fallen in love with stargazing. I don't think this is either instructions for how to write poetry. A lot of it is, especially in that second stanza, about them trying to figure it out on their own. They start blind and are trying to figure out how to write poetry. So I don't think it's just how to do it. Understanding and perseverance, understanding of perseverance, that the speaker understands perseverance and hard work. Again, maybe in the second stanza, that they're starting blind and working forwards. There's maybe something in there, but overall, I think hopefully through our discussions, we see this is a poem about someone discovering their love of poetry and their love of writing poetry. That it comes to them out of nowhere. It starts some fire inside them and it opens up these limitless possibilities of what they can do. And it gives them an identity too. So this is a poem about discovering a love for poetry and writing poetry, hence the title. That's Poetry by Pablo Neruda.